The plea was so small, so fragile, it nearly vanished into the winter air. Yet it froze Jonathan Hale in his tracks. One of the richest men in Chicago, a man used to cameras, contracts, and crowds, suddenly stood face to face with a little girl no taller than his waist. "Please save my brother," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve. She wasn't asking for an autograph or a photo. She wasn't even asking for herself. She was begging for the life of her brother, and nothing in Jonathan's fortune could have prepared him for what happened next. If this moment strikes you, let me know in the comments. Would you have stopped or walked away? Stay with me, because what unfolded inside that hospital turned from desperation to a battle that would shake Jonathan to his core. It had been a routine day for him. The kind of day billionaires know well. Photo ops, ribbon cuttings, smiling at cameras until your face aches. Jonathan had just left St. Mary's Medical Center, where his foundation had pledged millions for a new children's wing. He expected the evening to end in silence, sliding into his sleek car with tinted windows and driving back to his glass estate overlooking Lake Michigan. But instead, there she was, Snow, clinging to her scuffed boots, her braids uneven, her gloves mismatched, one pink, one blue. She looked like winter had been gnawing at her for months. Her teddy bear, worn nearly bald, was clutched under one arm. She couldn't have been more than 6. Yet she stood in front of him with a determination that didn't match her size. "My brother fell," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "He won't wake up. The nurses said, 'We have to wait, but nobody's coming. Please, sir, you're rich, right? Can you help rich people get things done faster?'" For a man who built his empire commanding boardrooms and bending markets, Jonathan found himself utterly powerless. His throat tightened. He could have brushed her aside, reminded her he wasn't a doctor, walked away into the warmth of his waiting car. But the look in her eyes stopped him cold, an odd mixture of fear, courage, and faith that a stranger could do what an entire hospital wouldn't. He glanced through the glass doors behind her, where the lobby buzzed with muted urgency. Then a shout split the air. "We need a nurse here now." The girl's face crumpled with panic. "That's him. That's my brother Matthew." And before Jonathan could think, she darted back inside. Something in him snapped to the same instinct that once drove him to outmaneuver rivals, now dragged him after her. Inside the lobby, chaos was unraveling in slow motion. A boy lay limp on the cold tile floor, his face pale, his lips faintly blue. Orderlies hovered, but hesitated, paralyzed by protocol. A young nurse fumbled with the phone, repeating phrases like supervisor and authorization, while precious seconds bled away. The girl, Emily, dropped to her knees, pressing her tiny hands against her brother's cheek. "Matt, wake up. Please, don't leave me." Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. She just kept whispering as though sheer will could pull him back. Jonathan's chest burned. For 8 years he had buried the ache of losing his own daughter, Grace, to congenital heart failure. And now, here it was again, her ghost staring back at him through the sight of another child collapsing in a hospital hallway while people stood frozen by red tape. Something hardened in him. "Why isn't anyone moving?" he barked, his voice carrying the steel that once intimidated senators and CEOs. The nurse blinked at him, flustered. "We're waiting on approval." Approval. Jonathan's voice cut like glass. He's a child, not a form to be stamped. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of authority that no one dared challenge. Within moments, the air shifted. A gurney appeared, oxygen hissed, and a resident rushed in. For the first time that night, people moved. Emily clung to her brother's hand as the team wheeled him down the hall. She didn't look back, but Jonathan did. He saw the nurse still frozen, her face pale, her lips parted as though excuses were stuck in her throat. He wanted to lash out, but the words came bitter and sharp. Save it. You already said enough by standing still. The automatic doors hissed shut, leaving Jonathan in the cold lobby, fists clenched, breath ragged. He had come here as a philanthropist. He was leaving as something else, someone dragged back into a war. He thought he had buried someone who could no longer buy silence to cover the sound of a child's plea. And all because one little girl looked up at him with snow on her lashes and said the words that broke him. "Please save my brother." Would you have ignored her, or followed her into the fire? Because what Jonathan Hale chose in that moment would not just change two children's lives, it would change his own in ways even a billionaire could never predict. The gurney's wheels shrieked across the polished linoleum, echoing through the wide corridor of St. Mary's Medical Center. Doctors and nurses shouted clipped instructions over the rising pitch of machines. At the center of it all, Matthew Carter's chest heaved unevenly, his breaths shallow, his eyes fluttering in a haze between this world and somewhere far darker. Emily stumbled to keep up her small hand, gripping the side rail, as though her touch alone could tether him to life. Jonathan Hale moved with them, his tailored coat flaring behind him like a shadow. He had been in plenty of emergencies in his life: boardroom, coups, market collapses, scandals threatening to ruin his empire. But this chaos felt raw, unfiltered, merciless. A child's life was slipping away, and the people trained to save him looked as though they were trapped in a maze of hesitation. Vitals dropping someone barked. The words ricocheted through Jonathan's chest. He leaned over the rail, staring at Matthew's face. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. His skin, once flushed with the warmth of youth, now carried the pallor of wax. His lips edged blue, and his eyelids trembled. Emily's voice cut through the din. "He can't breathe. Please don't let him die." Her plea was swallowed by the rush of bodies and the cold indifference of routine. The procession halted in a curtained bay. Machines wheeled in wires tangled a mask pressed against Matthew's face. A nurse stepped forward, blocking Jonathan's path. Her expression was polite but firm. "Sir, you need to step back. Only family can remain inside." Jonathan's jaw set. "That girl is his sister. You're telling me she can't stay?" "It's policy," the nurse replied, her voice soft but final. "Minors can't be in the trauma room. We'll do everything we can, but Jonathan snapped. "What exactly are you waiting for now?" "Another form. Another call upstairs." His words cracked across the room, pulling glances from white-coated figures who seemed to shrink under the weight of his fury. The nurse faltered eyes, flicking toward the charge physician who entered, his face taut with the exhaustion of too many night shifts. "Dr. Ramirez," she said quickly, as if summoning backup. Ramirez didn't flinch. He adjusted his glasses and approached Jonathan with the deliberate calm of a man used to storms. "Mr. Hale, I know who you are, and I assure you we are acting as fast as we can. But the boy's condition is complicated. He may need surgical intervention, possibly a transplant evaluation." "That requires," Jonathan cut him off. "It requires someone in this building to stop hiding behind procedures and act like a human being." His voice rose sharp enough to slice the sterile air. Emily tugged at his sleeve again. "Please don't let them take him away from me," she whispered. Ramirez crouched down beside her, his voice softer than before. "Emily, we're going to help your brother. But right now, we need space to work. Can you wait just outside?" The girl shook her head violently, tears brimming. "Every time I wait, people say they'll help, and they don't. They just say, we need more papers, more approvals. My mom signed forms last time, but nothing happened. Nobody listens." Her words landed like a blow to Jonathan's chest. He remembered Grace, the nights of promises from doctors, the endless jargon, the hope dangled like bait until it was too late. He wouldn't stand here and let another child endure the same agony. He turned back to Ramirez. "You'll keep her here. She deserves to see that you're not just another cog in this machine. You'll treat her brother like your own." His voice was low, but every syllable vibrated with command. Ramirez studied him for a long moment, then nodded once curtly. "Fine." She stays, but she doesn't interfere. The room swelled with renewed urgency. Compressions started, oxygen hissed, alarms shrilled. Jonathan stood at Emily's side, steadying her trembling shoulders. She buried her face into his coat but kept one hand stretched out toward Matthew, refusing to let go completely. Minutes felt like lifetimes. Then the monitor beeped, stronger, steadier. Relief rippled through the staff. Ramirez exhaled. "We've stabilized him for now. He's critical, but alive." Jonathan's shoulders sagged. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. Emily lifted her head, her face streaked with tears. "So he's not going to die." Ramirez's expression remained measured. "Not tonight. But the truth is, his heart is failing. Without a transplant, his chances are slim." The words struck like a verdict. Jonathan looked at the buoy wires snaking across his small body machines, doing what his heart could not. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt the weight of helplessness, the very thing his wealth was supposed to protect him from. Emily's grip tightened. "You can help him, right? You're rich. You can make them fix him." Her voice was small, yet it carried a devastating trust, as if the man she'd just met was her only lifeline. Jonathan swallowed hard. The billionaire who could bend governments now stood powerless before an 8-year-old's plea. But something shifted inside him, a spark reignited by her faith. He leaned down to meet her eyes. "I don't know how yet, Emily, but I swear to you, I won't let him slip through their fingers. Not like this." In that moment, the confrontation wasn't just between Jonathan and a bureaucratic hospital system. It was between Jonathan and himself, the man who once failed to save his daughter and the man who refused to fail again. The machines hummed, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and the city outside continued its restless churn. But inside that curtained bay, a promise had been forged. It was not bound by policy or paperwork, but by something far more dangerous, a billionaire's will sharpened by grief and ignited by the desperate plea of a child. The hospital grew quiet after the chaos, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel like peace but like exhaustion, like the world holding its breath. Emily had fallen asleep in a hard plastic chair beside her brother's bed, her small hand still resting on the edge of the blanket, as if she feared Matthew might slip away if she let go. Machines beeped in steady rhythm, keeping his fragile heart alive. Jonathan Hale sat nearby, his coat folded over his lap, his gaze fixed on the boy. In the soft glow of the monitor lights, Matthew looked even younger, swallowed by wires and tubes. For a man who had built towers of glass and steel across Chicago, who had faced presidents and kings, it was this image, a child battling quietly against death, that undid him. He had walked into the hospital as a benefactor. Now he sat as something else, entirely unsure if he was a rescuer or simply another bystander. The scent of antiseptic carried him back to nights he had sworn to forget. He could still see Grace lying in a bed, almost identical to this one, her dark hair fanned across the pillow, her chest rising and falling with the help of machines. He remembered the sterile words of doctors, the clipped tones of nurses, the way his money had bought better equipment, better specialists, but not time. No matter how hard he had fought, Grace slipped through his fingers, leaving behind only silence and an ache that never dulled. Jonathan leaned forward, pressing a hand against his forehead. He had promised himself he would never come back to this place, in his heart, never reopen the wound. But Emily had pulled him straight into it with her plea. And now, there was no turning away. A soft rustle broke the stillness. Emily stirred, blinking sleep from her eyes. She looked up at him, her face pale from worry, but lit with a child's raw honesty. "You're still here?" she said, her voice small but steady. "I told you I wouldn't leave," Jonathan replied. He tried to smile, but it came out tired. She rubbed her eyes with her fists. "Most people leave. After Mom got sick, they said they'd help, but they didn't. Even my uncle. He stopped answering when I called. Nobody stays." Jonathan felt a pang deep in his chest. He had heard those same words before, though never spoken aloud. They were the words Grace might have said if she'd been old enough to understand what abandonment felt like. He shifted in his chair, lowering his voice as if the night itself needed quiet. "Sometimes people run because they're scared. It doesn't mean you weren't worth staying for." Emily studied him, her brow furrowed as though weighing whether she could trust this man who had appeared out of nowhere. Finally she whispered, "Are you scared?" He hesitated. He could have lied, could have said no, could have played the role of the unshakable billionaire. But the truth pressed out of him. "Every day. But I'm more scared of doing nothing than of standing here with you." Something softened in her eyes. She leaned back in the chair, pulling her teddy bear close. "You sound like my mom. She said the same thing before she got sick. That doing nothing is worse." The words lodged in Jonathan's throat. He wanted to ask about her mother, about how two children had ended up facing the world alone, but Emily's expression closed around the subject, a quiet shield of pain he recognized all too well. Instead, he reached out, resting his hand gently on the rail of Matthew's bed. Emily mirrored him, her small fingers curling next to his. For a moment they sat in silence, two unlikely companions bound by grief and the stubborn refusal to let it win. Hours passed in the dim light. At one point, a nurse brought Emily a cup of warm milk from the cafeteria. She wrinkled her nose, but drank it anyway. And Jonathan found himself remembering when Grace had done the same, insisting that milk tasted like medicine, but drinking it because he asked her to. He almost laughed at the memory, but it caught in his throat and turned into something closer to a sigh. When Emily finished, she set the empty cup aside and whispered, "Do you have kids?" Jonathan's chest tightened. He could have said no. He could have sidestepped the truth. But looking at her, the way she sat upright, even though her eyelids sagged, the way she carried her brother's weight on her narrow shoulders, he realized she deserved honesty. "I had a daughter," he said quietly. "Her name was Grace. She was about your age when she got sick." Emily's gaze softened. "Did she get better?" The silence stretched before Jonathan forced the word out. "No." Emily didn't ask for details. She didn't press. Instead, she slid her teddy bear across the chair, nudging it toward him. "You can hold him if you want. When I get sad, Mr. Buttons helps. He makes me feel like I'm not alone." Jonathan stared at the worn bear, its seams fraying, one eye missing. He picked it up carefully as though it were made of glass. The gesture cracked something inside him, and he realized his hands were trembling. He hadn't held anything belonging to a child since the day Grace's toys were packed away. Emily settled back against the chair, her voice drifting with sleep. "You don't have to talk if it makes you sad. You can just sit here with us." So he did. For the first time in years, Jonathan sat in the quiet of a hospital room, not as a benefactor, not as a man trying to buy solutions, but as someone simply present. And as the night stretched on, he understood the bond being forged wasn't charity. It wasn't duty. It was something deeper, born of memory and pain, stitched together in the fragile hope that maybe this time staying would make the difference. The sky above Chicago was a dull slate gray when Jonathan Hale arrived at the Cook County Courthouse, the cold cutting through his coat as though determined to remind him how harsh the world could be. Emily Carter walked at his side, her mittened hand gripping her teddy bear tucked beneath her arm. She had barely spoken all morning, her silence more eloquent than words. Matthew was still lying in a hospital bed with a heart that could give out at any moment, and now the court would decide whether Jonathan had the authority to make choices that could save him. Inside, the courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and floor wax. The waiting area was crowded, but the family courtroom where their hearing was scheduled felt smaller than Jonathan expected. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the state seal hung uneven behind the judge's bench, and the old carpet muffled the shuffle of shoes. It wasn't the grand arena he had imagined. Instead, it looked like the kind of place where lives turned on the stroke of a pen. Linda Foster, the social worker, was already seated at counsel table with a file so thick it seemed to contain the children's entire existence. She greeted Emily with a small nod, and Jonathan with steady eyes that carried both encouragement and warning. Across the aisle sat an unfamiliar woman with sharp cheekbones and an expensive coat, her lawyer whispering to her before the judge entered. Evelyn Sharp, a distant cousin. Jonathan had read the briefing the night before, though Emily had never once mentioned her name. The judge took her seat with quiet authority, a woman in her 60s who radiated no-nonsense efficiency. This is the matter of Carter minors, Matthew and Emily. Petition for emergency guardianship and medical consent. Appearances. Each attorney introduced themselves. Jonathan sat still, aware of Emily's small hand gripping his sleeve. When the room quieted, the judge looked to Linda. "Miss Foster, your report." Linda rose, adjusting her glasses. Matthew Carter, age 9, is admitted at St. Mary's Medical Center with advanced heart failure. His attending physician, Dr. Ramirez, has provided an affidavit stating urgent transplant evaluation and surgical intervention are required. Emily Carter, age 6, has no legal guardian available. Their mother is deceased, father unknown. No verified relatives have provided care. Mr. Hale has petitioned for temporary guardianship limited to medical decision-making and placement. I conducted a preliminary home visit last night. The home is safe and suitable with separate bedrooms, prepared food in the kitchen, security measures in place, and arrangements made for nursing support and counseling. Emily appears bonded to Mr. Hale. She stated she feels safe and trusts him. The judge nodded, then looked to the opposing counsel. Evelyn Sharp's attorney rose smoothly. "Your Honor, kinship preference is the bedrock of child placement. My client, Miss Sharp, is family. Blood must matter. We urge the court not to grant custody to a stranger, billionaire or not. The publicity surrounding Mr. Hale raises questions about his motives. This is not a charity project. These are children." Jonathan's attorney stood voice measured. "Your Honor, kinship preference is important but not absolute. The statute is clear, the child's best interest prevails. Ms. Sharp has not been present at the hospital, has not contacted the department until today, and has offered no concrete plan for Matthew's urgent care. Mr. Hale has provided stability, immediate support, and medical resources in a life-or-death situation. Delay here could cost a child his life." The judge turned to the guardian ad litem. Recommendation. The gal rose, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and ink stains on her hands. "I met Emily this morning. She understands her brother is very sick. She told me Mr. Hale stays when it gets late. For a child who has seen too many adults disappear, consistency is critical. Given the urgency of Matthew's medical condition, I recommend granting Mr. Hale temporary guardianship for medical consent and placement with review in 30 days and an expedited home study." The judge shifted her gaze to Jonathan. "Mr. Hale, stand and address the court. In plain terms, what will you do for these children if I grant this petition?" Jonathan rose. His hands were steady, though his chest burned with the weight of the moment. "If you sign the order, Matthew gets treatment now. No delays, no waiting for paperwork. I've already retained a pediatric transplant coordinator to assist Dr. Ramirez. I will fund any uncovered medical costs. Emily will remain in my home, attend school with support, visit her brother daily, and receive counseling. I welcome supervision home visits, whatever oversight the court requires. I am not here for headlines. I am here because a 6-year-old girl asked me not to leave, and I intend to keep that promise. Evelyn's lawyer leaned forward. And if the cameras show up, Mr. Hale, will these children become a prop for your image? Jonathan didn't look at him. He met the judge's eyes. I can shut out cameras. I can't shut out the clock running out on Matthew's heart. The judge studied him for a long moment, then turned her attention to Emily. Would you be comfortable speaking, young lady? Emily glanced up at Jonathan. He bent down, whispered, Only if you want to. She nodded. The bailiff lowered the microphone. Emily clutched her bear and stood on tiptoe. Emily, the judge said gently, Do you know why you're here today? Emily's voice was quiet but clear. My brother's sick. They said he needs someone to say yes so he can get better. Do you feel safe with Mr. Hale? Yes. Why, Emily's eyes flicked to Jonathan, then back to the judge. Because he didn't go home when it got late. The room fell silent. The words, simple as they were, landed heavier than any lawyer's argument. The judge leaned back. Thank you, Emily. You can sit. Emily slid back into her chair, gripping Jonathan's hand. The judge adjusted her glasses. The law favors family placement when appropriate, but kinship alone does not override urgency, continuity, or the children's expressed needs. Ms. Sharp has not provided care, not been present, and offers no concrete plan. The medical evidence is urgent. I find that temporary guardianship to Mr. Hale limited to medical consent and placement is in the children's best interests. Review set in 30 days. Home study to be completed in 14. Guardian ad litem to monitor and report. She signed the order. The scratch of her pen sounded louder than the shuffling of papers, louder than the hum of lights. For Jonathan, it was the sound of a door unlocking. In the hallway afterward, Linda handed him the certified copy. This gives you the authority you need. Dr. Ramirez can move now. Jonathan slipped the document into his jacket pocket, feeling the weight of it against his chest. Emily tugged his hand. Does this mean Matthew gets help? Yes, Jonathan said. No more waiting. They walked together toward the elevator, the world outside still gray and wet. But for the first time in years, Jonathan felt something stir inside him that wasn't grief. It was resolve, sharp and alive. He had been given permission not just by the court, but by a child who believed in him. And he intended to prove she was right. The winter sun broke through the clouds the morning Matthew opened his eyes. It wasn't much light, just a thin shaft through the hospital blinds, but it was enough. His chest rose evenly, no longer laboring against a failing heart. The beeping of monitors that once seemed like a countdown now sounded like reassurance. Dr. Ramirez stood at the foot of the bed, a rare smile breaking the professional mask. The surgery went as well as we could hope, he said, quietly. He's not out of the woods, but he's strong. Stronger than I expected. Emily was the first to lean in, her small hand brushing her brother's arm. Matt, can you hear me? His eyelids fluttered, his lips parting just enough to form a single word. Yeah. Her tears spilled over, but she laughed through them. For the first time in months, she looked like a child again instead of a soldier, bracing for the next loss. Jonathan stood back, watching the siblings cling to each other. Relief coursed through him, but so did something heavier. Grace's memory lingered in the quiet corners of his mind, yet the ache no longer crushed him. Instead, it reminded him of why he had fought, why he had refused to let bureaucracy and indifference dictate another child's fate. The days that followed blurred with cautious optimism. Jonathan stayed at the hospital reading business reports in waiting rooms, signing contracts between conversations with doctors, his phone buzzing with calls he often ignored. For once, the world of finance and power seemed small compared to the fragile heartbeat of a 9-year-old boy. Linda Foster came by regularly, clipboard in hand, checking boxes and asking questions. Each time she left with a little less skepticism in her eyes. When Matthew was finally stable enough to be discharged, the hospital corridors echoed with the squeak of a wheelchair carrying him toward the exit. Emily skipped at his side, carrying a backpack stuffed with crayons and books she insisted he would need. Jonathan followed, hands in his coat pockets, aware that every step was both a victory and a responsibility. Outside, the air smelled faintly of thawing snow. A car waited to take them, not to an institution, not to some faceless foster placement, but to the house Emily now called home. That night, the house was no longer quiet and cavernous. Emily's laughter rang through the halls as she showed Matthew the room Jonathan had prepared for him, a bed piled high with blankets, shelves already lined with books and model cars. Jonathan stood in the doorway, watching the boy's eyes widen with disbelief. "This is mine?" Matthew asked. "It's yours," Jonathan said simply. The siblings settled in quickly, not because the house was grand, but because it was safe. They ate dinner at a long table that had been empty too many nights. Emily chattered about the school. Matthew asked questions about when he could play outside again, and Jonathan answered each one like it was the most important deal of his life. Later, when the children were asleep, Jonathan sat alone in his study. A photograph of Grace still held its place on the shelf. He picked it up, tracing the frame with his thumb. For years he had avoided the image, unable to face what it represented. Now, for the first time, he whispered, "We didn't save you, but maybe we saved them." The weeks passed with court reviews and home visits. Evelyn Sharp's objections faded under the weight of evidence, her absence, her lack of preparation, the undeniable bond between the children and Jonathan. The judge's final ruling came on a spring morning, the order granting Jonathan full guardianship. The gavel's strike was simple, almost anticlimactic, but its impact echoed like thunder. Emily squeezed his hand outside the courtroom. "Does this mean we're really staying?" Jonathan knelt to meet her eyes. "It means you're home. For good." Her smile lit her whole face, a smile free of fear. Matthew, still recovering but stronger each day, managed a quiet grin from his wheelchair. "Guess you're stuck with us," he teased. Jonathan laughed, a sound that felt unfamiliar but welcome. "That's the best deal I've ever made." Life settled into rhythms he hadn't known he missed. Mornings filled with the smell of pancakes instead of coffee, taken in silence. Afternoons with school pickups and therapy appointments. Evenings with stories read aloud, Emily correcting his voices for the characters, Matthew rolling his eyes but listening anyway. The mansion, that once echoed with emptiness, now carried the hum of ordinary life. There were still hard days. Nights when Matthew woke gasping, haunted by the memory of breathless panic. Mornings when Emily clung too tightly, afraid of being left behind. Jonathan faced them all not as a billionaire wielding influence, but as a man who refused to walk away. He learned patience in new forms, not in waiting for markets to turn, but in waiting for children to trust. Months later, on a warm evening, Jonathan stood in the backyard, watching Emily chase fireflies, while Matthew, still cautious but stronger, sat on the porch steps, cheering her on. The city skyline glowed in the distance, but here the world felt small, contained, safe. Emily caught a firefly, cupped it in her hands, and ran to Jonathan. "Look," she whispered, opening her palms just enough for the light to flicker. He watched the tiny spark rise into the night sky. For years he had lived surrounded by lights, neon LED, the glow of screens and skylines. But none of them compared to the fragile glow of that moment. Emily tugged at his sleeve. "You stayed," she said simply. Jonathan pulled her close, his eyes on Matthew, then on the stars above. "I told you I would." And for the first time in a long time he believed it not as a promise struggling to be kept, but as a truth already lived. The battle had been fought. The victory won, not in boardrooms or courts, but in the quiet persistence of showing up. And in that quiet, in the laughter of children, and the steady beat of a healing heart, Jonathan Hale finally found peace. Jonathan Hale's journey began with a moment that seemed insignificant on the surface. A child's hand tugging at his sleeve, her small voice breaking the winter air. "Please, save my brother." For a billionaire accustomed to influence and control, that plea was disarming. Yet it awakened something in him he thought had been buried forever. What unfolded from that night was not just a fight for medical care or legal guardianship. It was the rebirth of a man who had been living in the shadow of his own grief. In the sterile hallways of St. Mary's, Jonathan discovered that money could open doors, but it could not guarantee compassion. He watched Matthew's fragile body struggle, while staff hesitated behind procedures, and he felt the old wound of losing his daughter Grace rip open. Still, where he once withdrew into silence, this time he pressed forward. His determination was fueled not by wealth, but by a promise to Emily that he would not leave. Each confrontation with hospital administrators, with Evelyn Sharp in court with his own fear, became a test of his willingness to stay. The courtroom battle brought the story into sharp focus. Lawyers spoke of statutes and rights, but Emily's words told the real truth. He didn't go home when it got late. That single statement carried the weight of every night she had been left behind and every promise that had been broken before. It also revealed what Jonathan had become for her and Matthew, not just a guardian on paper, but someone who chose presence over convenience. When the judge granted Jonathan guardianship, it was more than a legal order. It was an affirmation that love is proven in action, not claims. Matthew's survival after surgery marked the turning of the tide. His heartbeat, once faltering, grew steady, and with it came the restoration of hope. Emily, who had carried more fear than any child, began to laugh again. And Jonathan, who had lived for years in a mansion echoing with absence, found his home transformed by the ordinary chaos of children's voices and daily routines. The house filled with life, and in their joy he found a measure of peace. Grace's memory remained, but now it served as a guiding light rather than a shackle. The lesson drawn from Jonathan Hale's story is deeply relevant to all of us. Life often confronts us with moments where someone else's need feels overwhelming, where stepping in might cost us time, comfort, or certainty. It is tempting to turn away to let someone else answer the call, but Jonathan's journey shows that presence itself is transformative. To stay, to show up, to remain when the night grows long, that is what changes lives. You don't need Jonathan's fortune to do this. Every one of us has the capacity to be someone's anchor in a storm. In our daily lives, this can mean standing with a friend through illness, offering patience to a struggling family member, or simply being the one who listens when no one else does. These choices, though quiet, are powerful. They ripple outward, altering not only the lives we touch, but our own understanding of what it means to live with purpose. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the strength that comes from compassion and the courage to stay, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating meaningful stories that inspire and uplift. Subscribe today and help us continue bringing powerful narratives to life, stories that remind us of who we can be when we choose love, presence, and courage over indifference.